What is better than a buttery, flaky croissant? Not much, I can tell you that. But it turns out that both the butter and the flake are relatively new additions to the croissant because neither were there when they first became popular, as can be seen in this French recipe from the 1850s. So thank you to Wild Grain for sponsoring this video as we learn the true and not so true origins of the croissant. This time on Tasting History. Before we get started, I just wanted to point out that the French translation of the Tasting History Cookbook is out, so if you speak French, that's the one to get. Also, if you are looking for behind-the-scenes content, because people are always asking for behind-the-scenes stuff, it is all over on Instagram, Tasting History with Max Miller, so go check me out over there. Now, the croissant has gone through several stages in its life, from the early days of the sweet Viennese Kipfel to the decadent cronut that took New York by storm in 2013. So when deciding which version to make for the episode, I had a few different options, but I ended up going with one of the first versions that would have actually been called a croissant, or as the French say, croissant. And while not strictly a recipe, one of the first descriptions of this new pastry came in 1853 by French chemist Anselme Payen, who categorized the croissant as a pain de fantaisie. In luxury bakeries, small loaves called croissants are prepared, usually in the semicircular shape of a roll curved and tapered at the ends. The liquid used to form the dough with 1 kilogram of flour consists of 1 or 2 eggs beaten and mixed with about 500 grams of water. Moreover, the choice of flour, the dose of yeast, as well as the working of the dough require the same care as when it comes to the other luxury breads mentioned. One of those other luxury breads he mentions is pain viennois, which instead of just water uses 3 parts milk to 1 part water. It is leavened with a sponge, which is a type of pre-ferment, and includes salt, but still no butter. Butter actually won't come around for some decades. So using these early descriptions, I'm going to try to recreate that mid-19th century croissant that does not use butter, and it should be a lot easier than making the modern version, which requires a lot of lamination of the dough, which is basically taking the butter, wrapping it in dough, folding it over, rolling it out, folding it over again, rolling it out, waiting. It's a whole long process, and that's what makes all of those wonderful flaky layers, but it is a real pain, and so yeah, I'm glad that that's not the one that I'm going to make. I have made it before, it's really good, but it is a lot of work, which is why I'm so glad to mention today's sponsor, Wild Grain, because they take a lot of the work out of baking. Wild Grain is the easiest and most delectable way that I know of to get fresh baked croissant, pastries, fresh pasta, and sourdough bread that are actually baked at home in your oven. They partner with small bakers and pasta makers around the country who produce their best doughs, which are then frozen and delivered to you so you get to actually do the baking. So in the case of fresh croissant, instead of 24 hours to make them from scratch, because that is how long it takes, you can do it in 25 minutes and they're baked at home so it's like you just got them from the bakery. They're as golden and flaky as you could ever want a croissant to be. I mean, look at these layers. Delicious. They've sent me several baked goods, including a sourdough loaf, which when freshly baked is so superior to anything you can find elsewhere. They also have a line of vegan options and gluten-free options, which are made in an entirely gluten-free facility. So to check out Wild Grain, head to wildgrain.com/tastinghistory or just click the link in the description and use my code TASTINGHISTORY to get $30 off of your first box, plus you will get free croissants in every box. Those, of course, will be modern croissants, so if you want croissants from the 1850s, you're going to have to make those from scratch, for which you will need 2 tablespoons or 18 grams of active dry yeast, 2/3 cup or 150 milliliters of water, 1.5 cups or 350 milliliters of whole milk, 10 cups or 1 kilogram of bread flour, 2 teaspoons of salt, and 2 well-beaten eggs. So first we are going to make our pre-ferment known as a sponge. Measure out 250 grams of the flour and add this to a mixing bowl with 250 milliliters of the milk and the yeast. Use a whisk to mix this until the liquid is fully incorporated, then cover it and set it aside to rise for about 45 minutes to an hour or until it's doubled in size. You don't want to let it go any more than that doubling in size because then you'll use all the yeast and it won't rise in the oven. But once it's doubled in size, add the rest of the flour, the salt, the egg, and the remaining milk and water and mix until the dough comes together. Begin to knead for about 15 to 20 minutes or until it becomes nice and smooth. Then set it back in the bowl, cover it up, and let it again double in size. This can take a couple of hours, or you can actually put it in the refrigerator overnight, let it rise for like 10 hours. It'll actually help the flavor, and you don't have to do all this in one day then. Once it's well risen, knock out the air and divide the dough up. And the size really depends on how big you want these croissants. It doesn't specify how big they're supposed to be, so I made some that are rather small, I made some that are rather big, and everything in between, just kind of to experiment. There are also many ways to shape a croissant. There are old descriptions that have you make it into a circle and then roll it and curve it around. There are others that have you have a equilateral triangle, but my favorite, and frankly I think the easiest way, is to roll the dough out to about 1/4 inch thick and cut it into a long triangle, and then cut the base just a little and pull the ends so it's roughly the shape of the Eiffel Tower. Then begin to roll it up and curve it in on itself so it is the shape of a crescent. Then set the croissants on a baking sheet, cover them, and let them rise for another 30 to 45 minutes. Now I looked at several other 19th and early 20th century recipes, and they all seem to have some sort of either egg wash or a sugar glaze on top. Most of the egg washes are actually egg yolk and milk, so that's what I'm going to be doing. What I did find interesting was that some of them are applied before they go into the oven, but then some of them are applied after baking, which will just leave like a raw milk and egg mixture on top, which I guess is fine, but it's kind of odd. So I'm going to go ahead and whisk some egg yolk with milk and then brush it over the croissants before setting them in the oven at 385 degrees Fahrenheit, 195 Celsius, and baking for 15 to 18 minutes or until they are a nice golden brown on top. Now it is my belief that these croissants will be the missing link of croissant history. They are not buttery and flaky like their modern version, but they're not going to be as sweet and crisp as their earlier version, an Austrian pastry known as the Kipfel. Any history of the French croissant must begin with its Austrian predecessor, the Kipfel, or Kipfel, or Gipfel. There are many, many different ways of spelling it. In fact, some of the earliest ways of spelling it are Chipfel or Chipfen, and those are what are said to have been given in 1227 to Duke Leopold VI, Leopold the Glorious of Babenberg, as a Christmas gift from the bakers of Vienna. This bread, whose name literally means mountaintop, is often thought as the precursor to the Kipfel, though we don't know what shape it was. It might have been a crescent. It doesn't actually discuss it that far back. It doesn't talk about the shape until the 1630s, when it was definitely crescent-shaped. And that brings us to the first and perhaps most enduring myth about the origin of the croissant. Picture this. 1683, and the Ottomans have surrounded the city of Vienna and laid siege for 2 months until, on September 12th, the famous winged hussars of the Kingdom of Poland arrive and, fighting beside the forces of the Holy Roman Empire, sweep the Ottoman forces from the field. In celebration, the bakers of Vienna bake a new bread and shape it, mockingly, into a crescent, the emblem which adorned the flags of the Turkish army. A wonderful story, and not too dissimilar from another story about a previous siege of Vienna, this time in 1529, again when the Ottomans were besieging the city. It happened a lot, but this time it's said that bakers made pretzels after hearing the Ottomans digging under the walls of the city. Now, neither of these stories have a grain of truth to them, or at least there's no reason to believe that they do, but it is nice to know that whenever the Ottomans lay siege to the city of Vienna, the world gets a new baked good. There's actually an alternative version of this story about the croissant that places the battle not in Vienna, but in Buda, which was half of Budapest, in 1686. But again, there's no reason to believe that the story is true, especially because we know that the Kipfel was already crescent-shaped before any of these battles were taking place. Also, because I'm talking about Vienna and Budapest, I wanted to let you know that next year, like a year from now, I'm actually going to be leading a river cruise on AMA waterways along the Danube, so if you're interested in joining, I'll put a link in the description. Now, if there are no period records to link the origin of the croissant shape to the Ottoman flag, well then why do so many people believe this story? Well, it seems to have started to crop up in the 19th century, and it was during a period when a lot of historians just kind of enjoyed making up stories about how things originated. It happened all the time. And then it gets a lot of detail around 1903 in something called the Baker's Book. The crescent, or Vienna Kipfel, originated with baker Peter Wendler and his wife, who had a bakery at number 841 Grünengasse, Vienna, at the time the Turks beleaguered the city. This baker had that patriotic, humorous idea to give his rolls the shape of the half moon or crescent, the emblem of the Mohammedans. His crescents at once found a ready sale. Everybody wanted to devour the crescents from patriotic impulse. In the house above mentioned, a bakery has been operated since 1585 up to the present day. The specifics! I mean, how could it not be true with such details? Except for the fact that the baker in question, who did live and was a baker, died 3 years before the battle, so yeah, didn't happen. So the story isn't true. But what is true is that the Kipfel, the crescent-shaped Kipfel, was a very popular baked good at the time, and by the 18th century was being made of the finest Hungarian flour and could be found in all the bakeries of Vienna in different flavors like anise and cinnamon and vanilla, all delicious. But then how did this Kipfel make its way from Vienna to Paris? And again, here we have truth and we have fiction. And as is so often the case, the fiction is a lot more popular than the truth. The story goes that it was brought to Paris with none other than Marie Antoinette. Marie Antoinette was from Vienna, and she did bring a Viennese baker with her when she married the Dauphin Louis, who later became Louis XVI of France. And in the video that I did on Marie Antoinette, I mentioned a quote from one of her ladies-in-waiting, a Madame Campan, who said that the queen breakfasted on coffee or chocolate, and a kind of bread to which she had been accustomed in her childhood in Vienna. But the Viennese had dozens of breads to choose from, so who's to say that this bread was a Kipfel? Especially since there's no record of anyone else having eaten these breads except for Marie Antoinette, and they don't really make another appearance in Paris until about 50 years after she lost her head. Now, it's always nice to tie an origin story to a famous name like Marie Antoinette, but in this case, I think it's even more interesting that we actually know who did bring the Kipfel from Vienna to Paris. A man named August Zang. And here I have to give credit and just amazingness to this book. It's by Jim Chevalier, and I have never seen a book that has gone so in-depth on a specific piece of baked good history as this book. So if you really want to deep dive into the croissant and its history, I'll put a link in the description to that book. It's really quite well written. Anyway, August Zang is the man who brought this baked good to Paris. But that's not what he was really known for during his lifetime, because he was famous for other things that had more notoriety in the 19th century, like owning a bank, owning a mine, and starting Die Presse, a newspaper which is still printed today in Vienna. But before all that, he was a disappointment to his father when he dropped out of school to join the military as an artillery officer. And at some point in the 1830s, he is said to have visited Paris and tried the bread and been decidedly unimpressed. See, Paris has not always been the bread mecca that it is today, because at that time, most of the leavening was done with sourdough, which I love sourdough, but back then it was thought of as kind of poor people bread, and it was chewy and dense, while breads in Vienna and places like England were using ale yeast or ale barm to leaven their bread, and you got a much lighter, softer bread from it. So Zang, seeing an opportunity to bring better bread to the people of Paris, went back to Vienna, gathered up some bakers, because he wasn't actually a baker, and headed back to Paris, where in 1838 or 1839, he and a fellow officer, Ernest Schwarzer, opened the Boulangerie Viennoise at 92 Rue de Richelieu. And it only took about a year for the bakery to take off. In November of 1839, the French newspaper La Presse announced that the Parisian public, who know how to appreciate good things, flocks to the Viennese bakery and patisserie, Rue Richelieu 92. The elegance of the stores, and above all, the exquisite merchandise offered there, will ensure the prosperity of this establishment. And later that same month, following the premiere of Hector Berlioz's Romeo et Juliette, they printed, "To tell the truth, what is most discussed following the Berlioz concert is the Viennese bakery, which attracts the crowds on the Rue de Richelieu. These exquisite and crunchy little loaves, framed by superb curtains, lit by brilliant candelabras, are a very pleasing picture to the eyes. This new way of composing music and making rolls is quite an event in Paris." Now, Zang and his bakery were making a number of baked goods other than the Kipfel, but it does seem that it was the Kipfel that left its lasting mark on the bakers of Paris. Though there are stories that he also invented the baguette, though there doesn't seem to be any evidence directly supporting that. What he did do was invent in 1842 a version of a steam-injected oven that is still used in a obviously later form in Paris and many bakeries today, that lets the inside of the bread get nice and soft and the outside develop a wonderful crust. But it was his Kipfel, at least at the time, that gave him some notoriety in Paris, and it wasn't long before other Parisian bakers started copying this and other Viennese breads that he was making. Before Zang, many writers lamented the poor quality of bread in Paris and really France as a whole. But just a decade or so after Zang came along, the Parisian is so spoiled that however limited his means, he will have none but the whitest bread. Many of the old kind are becoming obsolete or are superseded by pain anglais and by pain viennois. And it's around this time that the Paris bakers dropped the name Kipfel and started referring to the baked good simply by its shape of a crescent or croissant. And within decades, the croissant had become very, very popular, and really the whole bread world of France seemed to have turned around. In 1872, Charles Dickens wrote a short piece called The Cupboard Papers, where he bemoans how, when it comes to bread and meat, the English show a wasteful and dismal monotony. But in France, the varieties, not only of form, but of solidity and flavor, are endless. From the prodigious loaves that are sold in Normandy to the dainty croissant on the boudoir table. Though the texture of the dainty croissant was still probably more like the Kipfel than a modern-day croissant because, again, still no butter. And even when butter starts to be introduced into the recipes in the late 19th century, it's included as it would be like a brioche dough, not laminated with flaky layers like the pastry that it is now. But regardless of the texture, they were everywhere. One newspaper even accused the croissant of eclipsing all other baked goods in France and said that it was imperative to save certain rare breads from oblivion since the croissant begins to replace them everywhere. But perhaps nothing shows the importance that the croissant had on the bakeries of Paris, on the people of Paris, than a possible baker's strike in 1891. The newspaper Le Gaulois insisted that Paris is good-natured. It is prepared to allow everything. Strike by omnibus drivers, strike by hairdressers, and even strike by laundresses. But should you touch its patisserie, stop it. Paris bares its teeth. The bakers of Paris were threatening to strike, and this could not stand. And it wasn't bread as a whole that was really the issue. It was the croissant that brought both rich and poor together. From the Bastille to the Arc de Triomphe, the cry rang out. This is how our Parisian women reasoned, and those from less wealthy neighborhoods spoke roughly the same language, for it was the croissant that was threatened. Croissant of a sou and croissant of 2 sous. One cannot imagine the importance of this item in the Parisian bakery. A house in our neighborhood sells 3,000 to 4,000 a day, and that's just to passing customers. Another, which is not very far away, sells more than 10,000. Fortunately for us today, the Parisian bakers got back to work. And it wasn't long, it was around 1905 that we first see recipes that give a rudimentary version of a buttery, flaky croissant with the lamination. Not exactly the same as today, but it's on its way. Ironically, today, a lot of times croissants are not even crescent-shaped anymore, especially when they're stuffed with fillings like chocolate or raisins or almond cream. I even had one that was stuffed with a creme brulee cream. It was absolutely amazing, and I don't care that it wasn't shaped like a crescent, but it is interesting that the name really no longer applies to the shape, but to the style of bread. Whereas in the 1850s, it was less about the style of the dough at all, and all about the shape. That's where it got the name croissant. And I am hoping that my croissants from the 1850s have kept their shape. Once they're baked, let them cool, and they are ready to eat. And here we are, the French croissant of the 1850s. It's kept its shape pretty well. Some did better than others. It looks really lovely inside. It's a little close. Maybe, like I said, I think I could have let it prove a little bit longer, but it's so soft. It's definitely more like a brioche, anything like a modern day croissant. Let's take off a piece here. I mean, it's just warm bread. It doesn't have a ton of flavor, you know, it's very plain. It's just bread. It doesn't have any butter in it. It could use some butter. It could use some jam or something on top, but it doesn't need it. It's just nice, soft bread. The texture is lovely. Very, very different from a modern croissant. A lot easier than a modern croissant, especially if you can get the shape. That's really what the whole point of this is. Anyway, make modern croissant, go buy yourself a croissant, go find one of those creme brulee stuffed croissants that I had. I can't remember where it was. Some bakery in New York, I think. It's amazing. Spend the rest of my life trying to find that croissant. Make croissants, eat croissants, have a croissant in your life, and I will see you next time on Tasting History.